Welcome to Can End User Apps Be Open Source at the OW2online 2020 conference. I'm very happy to participate to this first online conference, and I hope you're having a great time at home. So who am I? I'm Ludovic Dubost, CEO and founder of XWiki. We've been developing at XWiki the XWiki software for more than 15 years. This software is a collaborative software allowing you to help organize your information. We're also building the CryptPad software, which is an innovative software allowing to collaborate in real time and edit documents while these documents are fully end-to-end encrypted. It's a system that will protect your information. All our developments in the last 15 years have been open source, and we've been developing the business of XWiki so that we can sustain the development of this software. So first, I'd like to point out that open source is quite strong. We have the feeling that open source is everywhere. Open source is the key of the internet infrastructure. It's also completely prevalent for development tools and libraries, and we can see that actually most proprietary software today do love open source and are built on top of them. However, if you look a little bit at the financials, then if you consider that there is a $1 trillion tech industry and a lot of them being developers, well, when we try to analyze the open source businesses and whether it is open source being developed by the large tech giants, or whether it is open source developed by commercial open source companies, then we get to some level around 10 billion, and it's not easy to get further than that. And if you look at donations to open source developers, then we're still in the million or tens of millions of dollars. And this actually represents just one store of the big tower that represents that tech industry. We can also actually see that there is a ceiling for end user apps. So while we have a lot of development tools and we have a lot of infrastructure systems that are very strong with open source, well, when it comes to end user apps, we see that they compete with a lot of cloud services, which themselves are using a lot of open source code, but are not open source themselves. And this competition has the effect today that a lot of these applications are actually provided by cloud or proprietary providers. So there is a domination of the cloud and proprietary providers when it comes to end user apps. So I won't go too much in the details why we need open source end user apps. We're all here convinced that this is what we want. I mean, there is control, there is sovereignty, there is openness, flexibility, and freedom, and it's not the subject of the presentation today. What I want to look at is the differences of the business model of the cloud and proprietary software business and the open source ones. Well, if we analyze the proprietary software provider, so you have a few providers that are collaborating on some open source code, mostly libraries or development tools, and they are providing high margin services to customers based a lot on proprietary code or on cloud services that they provide. You also have sometimes open source companies that work on the same libraries and try to get some revenue or get some revenue from this company or from end user company that are using the software, which makes that the open source community around the open source code is quite vibrant, but it represents a small fraction of the actual value that is provided to customers. When we look at an end user open source app business model that is providing an app directly to customers, you realize that it's not multiple companies that work off the same code base. It's often one company, which is the main contributor to the open source code, and there are not that many alternate contributors to that code. So sometimes that company has proprietary or paying modules, which represents a fraction of the value add compared to the open source code. That open source code is also used directly by open source users for free. And the open source company is making revenue directly with customers that are transforming from the open source users. Well, the open source code can also be used by other company, cloud or proprietary software companies. This creates 4 questions that make it not necessarily easy for the open source company. The first question is, are open source users actually contributing or buying services? The second one is, can all other open source companies join and contribute to the same code? Third question is, can cloud providers be partners or are they competitors? The fourth question is, how big is the proprietary code in the offer of the open source company in order to be able to sustain the open source business? So if we look, these 4 questions make it a challenging business for open source companies to compete with the cloud SaaS services. If we summarize, it's harder to get contributors and sell services to end user. You have less companies building on the same code base. You need to rely more on paying products to finance the code and scale, and cloud hosters can potentially compete with your own software. How can we actually fix that? The first problem is, are open source users contributing? Well, this raises a question for open source users that if they want more open source app, they need to question themselves, how is that open source company living and who is producing that software? And one way or another, they need to find a way to contribute to that free software. Public administration actually do, because they help fund a lot of open source R&D through French or European projects. At XWiki, we've been very happy, both for XWiki and CryptPad, to be able to have some funding from public entities. So one way for end users, for users to contribute to the software is to contribute to the community itself, participate to the community. This is the essence of open source. Open community, you can come and help with the software. You can also sponsor a feature. At XWiki, we've had a lot of sponsorship of feature, and this is quite interesting to fund the R&D. But these type of funding, they don't help maintain a long-term funding of the open source developers. And this is what support or extensions can help. And so as an end user, if you pay support or buy extensions, then you will help fund the open source code. And the fourth way, which is more rare, is donate, but it's something that is developing with Open Collective, for example. Now, the second question is, can other open source software companies contribute? So is there a way for the different open source companies that work together in the same ecosystem to potentially work together? So first, if you're a company, and if you're a service company, or if you're a development company, then you can pay support, or you can buy pro version or sell pro versions to your customer. You can also donate. The same things that apply for the end user can also apply for an intermediary or another developer that would work with the same code base. Open source companies should integrate with other open source apps, so there can be partnerships between the open source companies, so that it's possible to provide a bigger offering instead of potentially competing with each other. You can contribute to the community. And another aspect is that there could be stricter licenses also to protect the whole open source ecosystem from the non-open source ones, which could use the same code base. So the use of stricter licenses like AGPL can help give the open source software industry some advantage over the non-open source industry by the fact that each other, they can reuse the software of the other open source users. Another thing that hasn't been really worked on is how can you share business towards the upstream open source code. So if an open source developer is reusing another open source tool, how can they share the value with the different providers of the open source code? The third question was, can cloud providers be partners of competitors? We've seen that cloud providers can actually decide to be competitors, but if they do, they will destroy the ecosystem. So we need some way where it's going to be more a win-win between cloud providers and open source providers, and cloud providers need to support open source apps. And one very interesting way to actually do that is to develop marketplaces of open source software. It would be really valuable to have a marketplace which will bring back support revenue or paying revenue to the developers of the open source software, and not only revenue to the cloud providers through the hosting. And the stricter licenses and paying module here are also potentially a protections towards the cloud providers that would not work together with the open source developer to create a win-win situation in terms of what is being provided. Another aspect is that the marketplace could also be very interesting for public administration to provide open source software to the public administration and also bring back some revenue to the initial developer of the open source software. For the fourth question is, how big is the paying service box? So what is for sure is that paying services are key to fund open source code. If you only fund a software developer using pure services, pure development services, it's going to be almost impossible to scale. And it's going to be hard to build very advanced end user software. And for sure, not everything can be free. If everything is free and all users are using everything for free, then there's going to be an impossibility at some point to finance the software. The only way to finance it will be to pay for certain specific modules, but maintenance will never be financed, for example. And here, now what I want to point out is that it's not necessarily necessary here to make this paying package proprietary software. It is possible to make paying packages that are open source themselves. And this is a choice that we have decided to do at XWiki, where all our software is open source under the same license, LGPL, but we're not packaging these modules and these extensions to XWiki for free. We're packaging them paying on our extension repository and selling these extensions. But if other providers want to come work with us on the code, then it's possible because everything is open source. It's important also for the open source provider to control the level of non-open source R&D. At some point, if your amount of R&D is going in majority to proprietary software or to services for selling, then you're not really an open source provider anymore. And this is where transparency is actually quite important. I think open source companies should bring more transparency to how they make business and what amount of R&D they're spending for which part of the business, and to show that they are a provider that has the objective of sustaining the open source model. What I want everybody to remember is that open source apps cannot be fully free, because it's going to be very difficult to develop them, and that one way or another users need to support them. You can contact me by email, or you can also use our software on XWiki.org or CryptPad FR, and you can also support us on Open Collective. Thank you very much, and have a great OW2 online conference.